Hi everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute here while we wait for people to join us from the waiting room. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar will be on protecting housing and homelessness programs. The speakers will be talking about federal updates as well as actions you can take. Before we get started, I just want to quickly tell you about the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. We are a statewide coalition working to increase access to safe, decent, and affordable homes for all Pennsylvanians. Webinars are free for members. Become a member today. You can do that by visiting housingalliancepa.org/become a member, or you can contact us at info@housingalliancepa.org for more information. All right. Today's webinar will run for approximately 30 minutes, which includes time for Q&A. We encourage you to leave questions for our great group of speakers here today. If you want to ask the presenters a question, please use the Q&A function, which you can find to the bottom of your screen. The chat function is only to ask the Housing Alliance staff logistical questions about the webinar. So once again, please use the Q&A function for questions to the presenters. I also want to tell you about some of the upcoming Housing Alliance events. We have the Rural Pennsylvania Housing Summit, which will be held on July 23rd from 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. at the Nittany Lion Inn in State College, Pennsylvania. Registration is now open. You can scan the QR code that you see on the screen to pull up that page. We also do webinars every month. We have a webinar on July 29th on fair housing laws and HUD guidance workshop for service providers. You can scan the QR code that you see to the right hand of your screen to pull up our events page as well. With that, I want to pass it over to our great speakers for today. We have Gail Schwartz from the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania and Kim Johnson from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you to Gail and Kim for being part of this webinar and for sharing their knowledge and expertise with our audience today. I will be passing it over to Gail now.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you all for joining us today. As Chris said, I'm Gail Schwartz. I'm the Director of Programs and Outreach here at the Housing Alliance. I think we are all feeling much anxiety because of the uncertainty and at times confusion at the federal level right now. But the one thing that remains true, regardless of what's happening in national politics, is that we know the solutions that work. The work you all do, from housing crisis assistance to housing counseling to building affordable housing, can make a lifetime's worth of difference for those individuals and families you serve. As rent, housing, and community development costs rise every year, it is crucial for affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs to receive increased funding to maintain the number of people and communities they currently serve, which is still far below meeting the actual need. On May 30th, the current administration released its full fiscal year 26 budget request, proposing historic cuts to HUD's vital affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs. There are also proposed changes to rental and homelessness assistance that would leave more families struggling to make the rent at a time when we are seeing homelessness on the rise. The good news is that the budget has not passed yet. Ultimately, it will be up to the members of Congress to decide how to fund these vital affordable housing and homelessness assistance programs. So we all need to educate them on the solutions that we know work. Because these things are often changing rapidly, we strongly encourage all of you joining us today to do what we at the Housing Alliance are doing, which is following the lead of and responding to advocacy requests from national groups like the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And with that, I am pleased to introduce Kim Johnson from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. As a Senior Director of Policy, Kim is responsible for identifying and analyzing federal policy and regulatory activities related to the NLIHC's priorities and advocating around those policies and activities on Capitol Hill, as well as working with the organization's field team to engage members and network in advocacy. So let's see. Kim is here with the latest updates from Capitol Hill and what all of us can be doing to ensure our members in Congress will protect the vital affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs that help Pennsylvanians every day have a place to call home. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kim. She's going to go over the latest updates, and then we are going to hold questions until the end of her presentation, but please be sure to use the Q&A function.
Thank you so much, Gail. And thank you everyone for having me here today. Thank you too for the absolutely vital work that you all are doing in your communities to serve people in need. I just really cannot emphasize enough how important the work that you're doing is. And just, I can't thank you enough for everything that you all do. So I'm going to share my slides and we're going to get started. I do want to start off with a little bit of level setting, just trying to explain some of the differences between what is going on right now on Capitol Hill, because I know it is a lot to keep track of. We also had some breaking news as I was updating these, an hour ago to send to Chris and Gail so that they can share them with you after today. We also got more breaking news, so let's jump on in and get into it. And I want to make sure we have plenty of time at the end for Q&A as well, so keeping an eye on time. Let's jump on in. So this is me, I'm Kim Johnson. I'm the Senior Policy Director with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. That's my email. Please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions after the presentation. We're also going to be leaving you with a lot of resources to help you all take action in your communities too. So to do a little bit of kind of level setting, a little bit of table setting, if you will, before we kick off, just to establish the difference between two processes that are going along parallel tracks right now in Congress. So first is appropriations, which is often referred to as the annual federal budget process. And then we have reconciliation, the full name of which is budget reconciliation. Those two things get confused very, very often. At their very roots, they are related, but for the purposes of what we really need to know about this conversation, it's really, these are two separate processes that have two different outcomes. So appropriation is that yearly process to fund the federal government every fiscal year, and a new fiscal year for the federal government begins on October 1st. The appropriations process includes funding for HUD programs in the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, or THUD or THUD, spending bill. And it's important to note that new spending bills cannot be enacted with fewer than 60 yes votes in the Senate. So they require bipartisan support, and that's part of the Senate's filibuster rule. Now, reconciliation is a special legislative procedure that's not it's not usually used, but we see it being used more often. And it allows a bill to pass with just 51 yes votes in the Senate. So that means it can be enacted without bipartisan support if we have a House, Senate, and White House controlled all by the same party. So as we are in, the last time reconciliation was used, it was in 2021 for the American Rescue Plan Act, which we'll touch just a little bit on later in the presentation. But an important piece of reconciliation, so it allows that it's only that 51 vote threshold in the Senate. An important piece of that too, though, is that the provisions that are included in a reconciliation bill are restricted. Only provisions that impact the federal budget, the federal deficit one way or the other, so taxes, tax breaks, stuff like that can be included. As well as, sorry, I wanted to see if I had more details on that. Only stuff that relates to tax breaks, income for the federal government can be included, as well as changes to mandatory funding programs like Medicaid and SNAP. And so that's why we're seeing those attacks specifically on Medicaid and SNAP in reconciliation, but we're not seeing anything attacking HUD housing or HUD housing funding in reconciliation. So where things are now, like Gail said at the top, the president's FY26 budget request came out at the end of May. It's important to keep in mind as we go through some of the details of this request that it is just that it's an ask and not a mandate. So we still have a lot of power in pushing back and shaping what a final FY26 budget looks like. So don't despair even as we go through some of these very bleak numbers that were proposed. And that FY26 budget request also included a time limit on HUD rental assistance. And again, that is a proposal and not something that is actively going forward or a guarantee. And again, we're going to get into more details on that budget request too. The House and Senate are now working on their FY26 bill text. We're expecting the THUD bill to come out, well, these are older slides, so early July, we're expecting it in the next week or two. We know that the House is scheduled to start reviewing a process called markup, start marking up their bills in committee on July 14th. So we should have text before then, but we'll see how it all pans out. And there's a deadline for that FY26 budget when the new fiscal year begins of October 1st. Over on the reconciliation side, and this was a slide that I was just updating before I hopped on, but the Senate literally just passed their reconciliation package, and it is now going to get kicked back to the House. They are still trying like heck to finalize this very bad bill before the July 4th holiday. My understanding of House procedures, they need, I think it's 72 hours in advance to review a bill before voting on it, or maybe it's just 48. I think it might just be 48. And so they just passed it today, so they wouldn't be able to vote on it before Thursday. So we'll see how it all kind of comes together, and we'll talk a little bit, again, more about this soon. So one thing that I did want to flag related to the reconciliation bill, because while it doesn't have anything on HUD housing directly, it does have some provisions around the low-income housing tax credit that I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about in the Q&A. But the big flag that I wanted to share was something that our colleagues at the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council have been helping spread awareness of, and that's the impact of some of the Medicaid provisions on people experiencing homelessness. So I'm sure this is not a surprise to the folks on this call, but Medicaid is the primary health insurance program for unhoused people, people experiencing homelessness. And states have the flexibility to tailor systems and services in order to meet the often complex needs of people experiencing homelessness and those experiencing chronic homelessness. And we have that fact sheet too, which again, you'll have the links to all of this after the call. The reconciliation bill would impose work reporting requirements, as well as things like address verification, citizenship verification, and more frequent eligibility checks. I believe it's every 6 months as opposed to every year. That would make it a lot more difficult for people experiencing homelessness to have and maintain, to get and maintain coverage for Medicaid. So, for example, it can be really difficult if you're a person experiencing homelessness and working odd jobs to prove that you have work hours or an exemption for work hours. Not having a solid address, of course, is very difficult in order to verify your address as well as your citizenship. Documentation burdens. We know that people experiencing homelessness who are caught up in encampment sweeps often have their important documentation thrown away in the process of those sweeps. And of course, this is a huge additional burden for providers that providers are also not interested in seeing. And that impact would mean that people experiencing homelessness would lose access to their healthcare, including behavioral healthcare services, access to housing, medical respite care, and other services that can be provided through Medicaid. We would see increased homelessness and housing instability, as well as greater instances of illness, disability, and mortality among people experiencing homelessness. And of course, it is much, much more difficult to maintain employment when you are also struggling to afford healthcare coverage or struggling with a debilitating illness. So all of that is to say that is why I wanted to, touch on the reconciliation package. It does have implications for our work, even if it doesn't address housing as directly as, actually slashing funding for HUD. Ultimately, these provisions around Medicaid and SNAP, making it more difficult for low-income households to afford medical care and groceries is also going to make it more difficult for them to afford rent, because they will need to make their budget stretch even further without those additional subsidies and without that additional assistance. So take a little breath, because that's a bit of a bummer. It's not going to get better yet, but I promise it will. So to get into some of the details of President Trump's FY26 budget request, that request would make an historic cut to HUD funding, cutting it by 44% from the previous fiscal year. And as a reminder, the FY25 budget was also a continuing resolution, so it just maintained flat funding for HUD programs from FY24. So we already need additional funding in order to make up for kind of that gap left by the gap, the just yearly increase in the cost of delivering services to make sure that nobody loses their assistance. We did get some additional funding for voucher renewals in that final FY25 budget, but it is not enough to make sure that all vouchers are able to be renewed, and families don't lose, or we don't lose the number of vouchers that are available. Anyway, so this Trump administration budget request would cut HUD funding overall by 44% and includes a 43% cut to HUD's rental assistance programs and a proposal to really redesign rental assistance altogether, which we will get into some of the details of too. It would cut homelessness assistance grants by 13% from FY25 and consolidate continuum of care programs and the HOPWA, or Housing Opportunity for Persons with AIDS program, under the Emergency Solutions Grants program, in a move that the administration describes as an expanded ESG program. The practical effect of that, of course, would be that it would be a lot more difficult for communities to use their homeless assistance grant funding for permanent supportive housing, because ESG is inherently for emergency services and transitional housing. Consolidating those programs would make it a lot more difficult for communities to actually build permanent supportive housing for folks who need it. Another thing that was pointed out too during a presentation I was giving at a conference for the National Alliance to End Homelessness yesterday, the COC program, I believe, only has a cost share of something like 25%, while the ESG program has a cost share of 100%, a dollar for dollar match. So again, we're seeing this kind of cost shift onto states for all of these programs that the federal government has historically helped, support. This Trump administration proposal would also impose a 2-year time limit on receiving rental or homelessness assistance. You all, as professionals and as practitioners in these programs, will probably be asking very reasonable questions about what that would look like, whether it would be retroactive, whether it would be for currently assisted households or future households. We don't know the answers to any of that because the Trump administration did not bother to provide additional details. So really, I cannot emphasize enough how much this proposal was essentially really just floating out ideas without consideration for the practical effect or the actual running of these programs and how they would function or not function if these proposals went forward. So just to dig a little bit more into that, a great example is the state housing assistance, or the state rental assistance block grant, apologies, that's what it would be called, is a proposal that would consolidate 5 of the biggest housing assistance programs, housing choice vouchers, public housing, Section 202, Section 811, and project-based rental assistance into one big state rental assistance block grant, and then slash that funding by 43%. It would impose, again, that 2-year time limit. And while it says that it wouldn't include older adults or some people with disabilities, we don't know how they would be defining either of those terms either. And it does not include additional funding for emergency housing voucher renewals, which is another issue we're going to get into in a second. But all of this is to say, you know, there is no way that this proposal shakes out that does not involve people losing the assistance they rely on to keep a roof over their heads. And it's also important to point out that block granting programs leads to future funding cuts. History has shown this. When programs become block granted, they lose funding more quickly over time. And importantly, this would also put, again, a lot of this burden of cost sharing back onto states, and states would be responsible for deciding how those cuts would be implemented. So, for example, for the state rental assistance block grant program, okay, so when we look at the regular federal budget and say there's a 20% cut to housing choice voucher funding, I can turn to my friends at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and say, hey, what is the practical impact of this? How many people are going to lose their vouchers? And they can calculate that out. But when it's a block grant and it comes down to how states want to allocate that funding, it's a lot harder to really discern the impact of specific cuts because it comes down to how states implement it ultimately, and how those cuts kind of come together or come together, right? And so it's really just putting the burden back on states to both pay for this loss of assistance and implement the cuts that the administration is proposing. So I mentioned emergency housing vouchers, and again, just like keeping an eye on time and wanting to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. These are the last, I think, few slides. So we need additional funding to ensure that nearly 60,000 households currently assisted under the emergency housing voucher program do not lose their assistance. The EHV program was created in the American Rescue Plan Act back in 2021, which I mentioned at the top of the call as the last time reconciliation was used to pass a bill. And it created this program with $5 billion to target, originally it was 70,000 new vouchers to households and people at risk of or experiencing homelessness and those fleeing intimate partner violence or human trafficking. Nearly 60,000 households are still using a voucher, an emergency housing voucher, to keep a roof over their heads. And while funding for this program was supposed to last for a decade, so until 2035, no, 2031, yes. Funding is now projected to run out midway through 2026, and for some PHAs sooner. And that's because of the drastic increase in the cost of rent since the program was implemented. Throughout 2021 and 2022. We saw really historic increases in the cost of rent that really drove up how much funding was used in this program. So we're calling on Congress to provide funding to preserve these vouchers, or failing that, to ensure that EHV households can be folded into other rental assistance programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So where things are now, the House and Senate are going to be drafting their FY26 spending bills. Again, the House THUD subcommittee markup is scheduled for July 14th. So we should be seeing a bill before that. It remains to be seen how reconciliation and the continued, question mark around how all of that turns out also impacts this appropriations timeline. So the Senate appropriations and subcommittee and subcommittee markups are still TBD, but regardless, we have this deadline of October 1st. If I was a betting woman, which I am not, but if I were, I would bet on another continuing resolution, at least for the short term, but very likely, potentially even another year-long CR. And these are some resources too. I won't dwell too long on them, but just to give a little bit of an overview, we have an FY26 advocacy toolkit that has resources and ideas for advocacy for advocates and folks to take action. We've been working really closely with our partners at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the National Housing Law Project on an EHV toolkit so that advocates can take action on emergency housing voucher funding too. We also have launched recently an organizational sign-on letter calling for full funding for rental assistance programs in the FY26 budget. And what's exciting about that one is that it is also with some of our industry partners as well as developer partners in like the National Apartment Association, the National Multifamily Housing Council, really just reaching out to build broad support for continued funding for this program. Our colleagues at the National Housing Law Project also have a legal memo on the rights of EHV recipients. They're creating a story banking project for EHV recipients to talk about the impact that this program has had. We have additional links for the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council on the impacts of the reconciliation bill, and a link to take action to oppose healthcare and food assistance cuts in the reconciliation bill. All right. So I am going to stop share and hand it back on over to Gail to help us facilitate Q&A.
Yeah, so our first question is a clarifying question. Is the ESG program a distinct budget line item and not part of the proposed block grants?
Yeah, good question. So the ESG program normally is kind of its own distinct line item under the Homeless Assistance Grants account. Under this proposal, it would essentially say everything is ESG. HAG is ESG now and ESG is HAG. And so it would just all be this kind of big amalgam of like a block grant for homelessness assistance that would not provide nearly the same amount of funding or flexibility or kind of like possibilities, I think, that the current system has and supports.
Great, thank you. Our next question, is it realistic to believe that this administration is going to provide continuation of funding? Like, people are a little bit cynical right now, so.
Listen, same. But no, so what the good news there is that the administration doesn't get to decide. It is up to Congress to decide how much funding programs get, and that is where we have a lot of people power. Especially, in the great state of Pennsylvania, weighing in with your elected officials, your federal elected officials, making sure that they understand the impact of these proposed cuts, of some of these like nonsensical proposals around, restructuring rental assistance into a block grant. And really, not even necessarily coming at them from an adversarial standpoint, but rather saying too, like, hey, let us show you the good work that these funds are doing in our communities. Let us show you how these funds are helping to support your constituents. And so really just like helping them build that kind of understanding of these programs. Granted, I also live in the real world and I know that some people are more reachable than others. But I do think, starting that conversation, it's not going to be overnight necessarily. But having that conversation is still very, very important. And it's going to make the difference in defending programs and ensuring we have full funding this coming year.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you could just touch base on, what's happening with some of the more project-based housing programs, like Tech Home, project-based Section 8.
Yeah, definitely. So I didn't mention in I mentioned briefly in the overview of reconciliation. The Senate version of the reconciliation bill, last I checked, I haven't looked at like whatever they just passed. But last I checked, the Senate version of the reconciliation bill includes some provisions around the low-income housing tax credit to expand LIHTC. I am just looking up some of the resources on that so that I can share correct information. But yeah, let me, I'll find something before I hop off to share information about what the Senate provisions are. In the House, they included that kind of LIHTC expansion, but also included a reform that NLIHC also supports, which would designate rural and tribal areas as difficult to develop and designate them for a basis boost. But that got dropped out of the Senate version for whatever reason. For the home program, not mentioned in reconciliation, but in the president's budget request, it zeroes out the home program. And I don't need to point out to folks on this call the irony of, saying, oh, we're going to address the affordable housing crisis, and then zeroing out the programs that actually make those deals pencil out for developers. But again, the important thing to keep in mind too is that the president doesn't get to decide how much funding the home program gets. That's up to Congress. And so that is where we still have a lot of power in our advocacy and making sure that those cuts don't go forward.
Great. Well, I know that there's still some more questions, but unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. So I just want to say thank you again, Kim, for all of this valuable information. We will be sending up follow-up resources to everybody. Please know that the Housing Alliance is going to be continuing the conversation on federal advocacy. We are planning on hosting a meeting to talk about further actions and how we can coordinate with each other across the state. So please keep an eye out for that announcement. In the meantime, one thing that we can all do now is call your members in Congress and share how these programs help you, help your family, help your community, and that we need to be increasing, not cutting funding for affordable housing and homelessness assistance programs. So I just put a link in for taking action for the Housing Alliance. It will give you your member of Congress phone number and a script to use for the call. So we also still strongly encourage people to, if you haven't signed up already, to get newsletters from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, National Alliance to End Homelessness, NARO, National Coalition of State Housing Agencies. There's a wealth of resources out there, and the federal folks have been absolutely fantastic in keeping up on just how everything is changing from minute to minute. So thank you so much, Kim. Really appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll be having you back soon.
Thank you all.